When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the American medical establishment was woefully unprepared for the scale of human suffering that would follow. As thousands of young men rushed to enlist in both the Union and Confederate armies, they placed their lives in the hands of a medical corps that was understaffed, undertrained, and operating with scientific knowledge that would soon be considered archaic. The typical Civil War physician entered the battlefield with remarkably limited formal education. In the 1860s, medical training in America fell drastically short of European standards. Most American doctors had received less than 2 years of medical education, with some having attended lectures for merely a few months before being granted a medical degree. The Harvard Medical School, considered among the nation's finest institutions, required only 2 4-month terms of lectures, with the second term being merely a repetition of the first. Students were not required to demonstrate any practical skills or clinical experience before graduation. Medical schools of the era operated largely as profit-making ventures. Schools competed for students by keeping requirements minimal and graduation standards low. A survey conducted in 1870 found that of 540 physicians in one state, only 10% had received hospital training as part of their education. The remainder had simply attended lectures and perhaps witnessed a few demonstrations before being declared qualified to practice medicine. The curriculum itself lacked standardization. While anatomy was generally well taught through dissection, subjects like physiology, pathology, and chemistry received cursory attention. Some physicians entered practice having never administered medication, set a fracture, or performed even minor surgery. A Union medical officer, Dr. Charles Tripler, lamented in his reports that many newly commissioned surgeons could not diagnose measles or perform a simple amputation. For those physicians who had established successful civilian practices before the war, their experience typically centered on treating common illnesses like dysentery, malaria, and pneumonia. Few had encountered gunshot wounds or managed traumatic amputations. Even fewer understood the proper management of military hospitals or field medical stations. When confronted with battlefield medicine, many experienced doctors found themselves as unprepared as their younger colleagues. The Confederate Medical Service faced even greater challenges in physician preparation. Southern medical schools were fewer in number and often smaller than their northern counterparts. Many well-trained Southern physicians had received their education in the North or in Europe, creating a thin upper tier of well-qualified doctors amidst a broader base of poorly trained practitioners. As the war progressed, the Confederate Medical Department became increasingly desperate, commissioning physicians with minimal qualifications and assigning medical responsibilities to individuals who had merely worked as druggists or served as physicians' apprentices. Perhaps the most significant deficiency in Civil War medicine was the lack of understanding regarding infection and disease transmission. In 1861, Louis Pasteur had only recently proposed his germ theory, and Joseph Lister would not publish his groundbreaking work on antiseptic techniques until 1867. American medicine, isolated from European advances by the Atlantic Ocean and the ongoing war, remained firmly entrenched in miasmatic theory, the belief that disease was caused by bad air arising from decaying matter. This misunderstanding had catastrophic consequences. Surgeons operated in blood-soaked clothes, moving directly from one patient to another without washing their hands. Surgical instruments were wiped clean on aprons or sleeves rather than properly sterilized. The same sponges were used to clean multiple wounds, unknowingly transferring bacteria between patients. One Army surgeon recalled, "We operated in old blood-stained and often pus-stained coats, the veterans of 100 fights, with our instruments carried from case to case in our pockets. Water for washing wounds came from whatever source was available, often the same streams contaminated by latrines or animal carcasses. Dressings were frequently reused after being rinsed, and bandages were in such short supply that clean rags were considered a luxury. In this environment, it's little wonder that infection claimed more lives than bullets. The inadequate understanding of infectious disease extended beyond wound care. Army camps became breeding grounds for typhoid, dysentery, malaria, and other communicable diseases. Medical officers who attempted to enforce basic sanitation measures faced resistance from both commanding officers and troops. One Union medical director reported spending weeks trying to convince a general to relocate latrines that had been dug uphill from the camp's water supply. When the war began, both armies faced a severe shortage of medical personnel. The Union Army started with just 98 medical officers, most of whom were administrative rather than practicing physicians. The U.S. Army Medical Bureau, headed by the 80-year-old Surgeon General Thomas Lawson until his death in May 1861, had neither the personnel nor the organizational structure to support an army that would eventually number over 1 million men. The Confederacy's situation was even more dire. With no pre-existing military medical department, the Confederate Medical Service had to be built from scratch. By 1862, the Confederate Medical Department estimated it needed at least 3,000 physicians, but had fewer than 1,000 on duty. This shortage forced Confederate armies to rely heavily on civilian physicians in occupied territories and to assign surgeons to cover multiple regiments simultaneously. Both sides attempted to address these shortages through rapid commissioning of civilian doctors, but quality inevitably suffered. The Union Army Medical Department, under Surgeon General William Hammond's leadership beginning in 1862, implemented examination boards to test the qualifications of physician candidates. These examinations revealed alarming deficiencies. In one group of 30 applicants in New York, only 3 were found qualified for service. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who would later revolutionize battlefield medicine as the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, described the early medical corps as a mass of individuals without system, without definite responsibilities, and without authoritative supervision. Medical officers were assigned haphazardly, often based on political connections rather than competence. Some regiments marched to war with skilled surgeons, while others made do with physicians who could barely distinguish between basic medications. The shortage extended beyond physicians to support personnel. Neither army had established corps of trained nurses, ambulance drivers, or hospital stewards. These critical roles were initially filled by detailed soldiers, men pulled from combat units who often had no interest or aptitude for medical work. Early in the war, wounded soldiers frequently languished on battlefields for days because there was no organized system for their collection and evacuation. Adding to these challenges was the low status accorded to medical officers within the military hierarchy. Despite their critical role, surgeons were regarded as secondary to combat officers and faced significant obstacles in performing their duties. Military surgeons received lower pay than their combat counterparts of equivalent rank. A Union infantry captain earned $115.50 monthly in 1861, while a surgeon with the same rank received only $80. This disparity persisted throughout the war and was even more pronounced in the resource-constrained Confederacy. Beyond compensation, medical officers struggled with limited authority. They could make recommendations regarding camp sanitation, food quality, and the evacuation of the wounded, but implementation required approval from commanding officers who often prioritized tactical considerations over medical concerns. After the Battle of Bull Run, Union Surgeon Charles Tripler reported that his ambulances were commandeered by retreating soldiers despite his protests, leaving hundreds of wounded men stranded on the battlefield. The status problem extended to equipment and supplies. Quartermasters routinely prioritized ammunition and rations over medical supplies when allocating limited wagon space during campaigns. One frustrated Union medical director wrote that he had been allocated 3 wagons for medical supplies for an entire division, while the colonel's personal baggage occupied 2. Confederate surgeons faced even greater challenges, as the Southern blockade increasingly restricted the importation of essential medicines and surgical instruments. Medical recommendations regarding the health of troops were frequently overruled by commanders focused on military objectives. During the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, Union medical officers warned that camping in the swampy areas along the Chickahominy River would lead to widespread disease. Their concerns were dismissed, and within weeks, thousands of soldiers fell ill with Chickahominy fever, likely a combination of malaria and typhoid that significantly reduced the Army's fighting strength. The relationship between medical and line officers improved gradually as the war progressed, particularly in the Union Army after the establishment of the Ambulance Corps in 1862 and the reorganization of the medical department. However, tensions persisted throughout the conflict. Medical officers who insisted too strongly on the welfare of their patients risked being labeled as obstructionists or lacking military spirit. Dr. Henry Bowditch, whose son died after receiving inadequate medical care during the war, later wrote, "The surgeon in our armies was looked upon as a non-combatant, almost as a civilian, useful perhaps in his way, but not to be compared in importance with the veriest lieutenant." This attitude affected not only the morale of medical personnel, but directly impacted patient care, as medical recommendations were subordinated to military expediency. The challenges facing Civil War medical personnel were compounded by the rapid evolution of weapons technology that outpaced medical advances. The widespread use of the Mini-A ball, a conical bullet that expanded upon impact, created devastating wounds that shattered bones and destroyed tissue far more extensively than previous round musket balls. Surgeons trained in the Mexican-American War or earlier conflicts found themselves unprepared for the severity of injuries produced by these more destructive projectiles. Artillery technology had also advanced, with exploding shells creating complex, contaminated wounds unlike anything most physicians had encountered in civilian practice. The nature of these injuries often necessitated immediate amputation, a procedure that many newly commissioned surgeons had never performed before their battlefield service. One Union surgeon recalled performing his first amputation during the Battle of Shiloh. "My hands trembled so that I could scarcely hold the knife, but the man would have died without intervention, so I proceeded as best I could remember from my lectures." As the wounded poured into field hospitals following each bloody engagement, Civil War medical personnel faced their grim work armed with an arsenal that modern practitioners would consider shockingly primitive. The standard surgeon's kit of the 1860s contained instruments that had changed little since the Napoleonic Wars. Typically housed in a mahogany or rosewood case lined with velvet or silk, these kits presented a deceptively elegant appearance that belied their brutal purpose. The centerpiece of every military surgeon's equipment was the amputation set. A complete kit contained capital saws for larger limbs, metacarpal saws for fingers and smaller bones, several sizes of knives for incisions and tissue separation, tourniquets, bone forceps, and arterial forceps for clamping blood vessels. The Liston knife, named after Scottish surgeon Robert Liston, was particularly common, a long, straight-bladed instrument designed to cut through flesh and muscle in a single swift stroke. These blades lacked the specialized coatings and alloys of modern surgical steel. They dulled quickly and required frequent resharpening during surgery sessions. The bone saws used for amputations were particularly crude by modern standards. Featuring wooden handles and carbon steel blades with wide-set teeth, these instruments required significant physical effort to use. One Union surgeon described the process. The saw catches and jerks, requiring the assistant to firmly hold the limb while you work the instrument through the bone. In the heat and rush of battle surgery, the saw often binds in the bone, especially when the patient struggles. The physical toll on surgeons was immense, with many developing hand and wrist problems after performing dozens of consecutive amputations. Surgical instruments were typically manufactured in England or Germany, with American-made instruments considered inferior in quality. When the war began, Northern surgeons had ready access to imported instruments, but Confederate medical services immediately faced critical shortages as the Union naval blockade tightened. By 1862, obtaining new surgical instruments in the South had become nearly impossible, forcing Confederate surgeons to rely on captured Union supplies, locally manufactured substitutes of questionable quality, or increasingly worn personal instruments. The Confederacy established several medical supply manufacturing operations in cities like Richmond and Atlanta, but these facilities struggled with inadequate materials and expertise. A Confederate surgeon stationed in Virginia wrote in 1863, "The instruments provided from Richmond are poorly tempered and lose their edge after 1 or 2 operations. The saws bind in the bone and the forceps slip from the arteries at critical moments. We prize captured Yankee medical kits above all else." Beyond the poor quality, the fundamental design of these instruments reflected an era before germ theory. Most featured wooden or bone handles with numerous crevices that harbored bacteria. Metal components were typically joined with solder or rivets that created additional spaces where blood and tissue could accumulate. The instruments were rarely disassembled for cleaning. Instead, they were simply wiped with a cloth between operations, sometimes rinsed in water, and occasionally dipped in alcohol, a practice that spread rather than prevented infection. The problem extended beyond instruments to the entire operating environment. Surgery typically took place on doors removed from hinges and placed across barrels, on kitchen tables commandeered from local homes, or even on window shutters balanced on crates. These makeshift operating surfaces were impossible to properly clean. Blood, pus, and tissue fragments accumulated in the wood grain, creating a perfect environment for bacterial growth. Supplies for wound management were equally primitive and chronically scarce. Lint, scraped linen fibers used as absorbent dressing material, was in constant demand. Women's groups in both North and South organized lint scraping parties where they would use knives to scrape linen cloth, collecting the resulting fibers for shipment to military hospitals. Despite these efforts, lint remained in short supply, leading to the reuse of dressings. Surgeons would remove soiled bandages, rinse them in water, and apply them to new patients, an almost guaranteed method of spreading infection. The shortage of bandages became so acute that surgeons resorted to using newspaper, clothing torn from the dead, and even leaves as wound coverings. In Confederate hospitals, where shortages were most severe, patients sometimes went days without dressing changes simply because no materials were available. One Confederate surgeon recorded, "We have taken to using the less damaged portions of the shirts removed from the dead for bandaging the living. It is a ghastly economy, but necessity allows no sentiment." Suture material presented another challenge. Modern surgeons use specialized sterile thread designed to minimize tissue reaction, but Civil War surgeons relied on whatever was available, often silk thread, horsehair, or even ordinary sewing thread. These materials were rarely cleaned beyond a quick rinse and frequently carried bacteria deep into wounds when used. Metal suture needles were reused countless times, becoming dull and rusty, increasing tissue trauma with each use. The Union's medical supply system improved dramatically after the establishment of the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the reorganization of the medical department under Surgeon General William Hammond in 1862. The Sanitary Commission, a civilian organization that supported the Union Army Medical Department, established supply depots near major Army encampments and developed an efficient distribution system. By 1863, Union field hospitals were generally well supplied with basic necessities, though quality and design remained problematic. Confederate medical services never achieved comparable logistical success. As the war progressed and the Union blockade tightened, even basic supplies became unobtainable luxuries. The Confederate Medical Department was forced to innovate with local substitutes for essential items. Surgeons extracted morphine from the unripe seed pods of local poppies, distilled alcohol from various fruits and grains, and manufactured chloroform using whatever chemicals could be procured. These substitutes varied wildly in potency and purity, making their administration dangerous and unpredictable. Perhaps no aspect of Civil War medicine better illustrates the primitive state of battlefield care than the management of pain. Anesthesia was relatively new to American medicine in 1861. Ether had been publicly demonstrated as a surgical anesthetic only 15 years earlier, in 1846, and chloroform had been introduced to medical practice in 1847. While both agents were recognized as effective, standardized administration methods had not been developed. Chloroform was generally preferred for battlefield surgery due to its quick action and compact form. Typically administered by dripping the liquid onto a cloth held over the patient's face, The dosage was regulated by the surgeon's subjective assessment of the patient's condition. Too little resulted in patients awakening during surgery. Too much could cause respiratory or cardiac arrest. One medical officer described the process. The chloroform is applied until the patient's struggling ceases and his breathing becomes regular. It is an inexact science at best, and in the chaos of a field hospital after battle, mistakes are inevitable. The physical apparatus for administering anesthesia was crude. While specialized masks and drop bottles existed, they were rarely available in field hospitals. Most surgeons used a simple handkerchief or cloth, sometimes folded into a cone. The anesthetic was poured directly onto this cloth, with much of it evaporating into the air rather than being inhaled by the patient. This inefficient method wasted precious supplies and exposed everyone in the vicinity to the effects of the anesthetic vapors. Surgeons and assistants frequently reported headaches, dizziness, and nausea from working in these unventilated environments. Ether, while somewhat safer than chloroform, was less practical for battlefield use. It required larger doses, took longer to take effect, was highly flammable, and came in bulky, fragile glass containers that were difficult to transport. Nevertheless, as chloroform supplies dwindled, particularly in the Confederacy, ether became the only option in many hospitals. By 1863, the Confederate Medical Department faced a critical shortage of anesthetics. Blockade runners prioritized more profitable cargo over medical supplies, and domestic production could not meet demand. Confederate surgeons increasingly performed procedures with minimal anesthesia or none at all. Patients were given whiskey if available, or simply held down by assistants during operations. One Confederate surgeon wrote, "The screams of the men under the knife are the most trying part of our work. When chloroform is available, we reserve it for amputations and major operations, using whiskey and opium when we have it for lesser procedures." Even when anesthetics were available, their administration was entrusted to the least experienced person present, typically a hospital steward or another patient well enough to assist. No specialized training existed for this critical role. The patient's vital signs were monitored haphazardly, if at all. One Union surgeon noted, "We judge the depth of anesthesia by the patient's breathing and the relaxation of his limbs. If he begins to struggle or cry out, more chloroform is applied." It is a crude method, but we have no better. The diagnostic tools available to Civil War surgeons were equally primitive. The stethoscope, though invented in 1816, was not yet in widespread use among American physicians. Many diagnoses were made based on visual inspection and palpation alone. For internal injuries, physicians relied heavily on subjective symptoms reported by patients and basic physical examination techniques that had changed little since ancient times. Locating bullets and shell fragments within the body posed a particular challenge. Without imaging technology, surgeons relied on probing wounds with their fingers or instruments. The standard bullet probe was a thin metal rod, often made of silver, because it was believed that silver would turn black when it contacted lead. The surgeon would insert this probe into the wound channel, feeling for the hard resistance of a bullet or bone fragment. This probing was performed without gloves or sterilization, introducing bacteria deep into wounds. The process was excruciating for patients, even when partially anesthetized, and frequently caused additional tissue damage. If the bullet had fragmented or traveled along an indirect path, probing often failed to locate all metal fragments, leaving foreign material in the wound that would later cause infection. In some cases, surgeons resorted to enlarging wound channels to permit exploration with their fingers. This practice, while allowing more thorough examination, significantly increased the risk of infection and tissue damage. One medical officer described the process. "Having failed to locate the ball with the probe, I was forced to enlarge the wound sufficiently to admit my index finger. The pain caused to the patient was severe, but necessary if we were to extract the foreign body." The thermometer, though invented, was not standard equipment in field hospitals. Fever was assessed by touch, leading to inconsistent evaluations of patient condition. Blood pressure measurement was unknown, with circulatory assessment limited to pulse rate and character. These subjective measurements made it difficult to accurately track a patient's condition or determine the effectiveness of treatments. For fractures, diagnosis relied on visual deformity, crepitus, and loss of function. Splinting materials varied widely in quality and availability. Union hospitals eventually standardized with mass-produced wooden splints, but Confederate surgeons often fashioned splints from whatever materials were at hand: fence boards, tree branches, or even weapons components. One resourceful Confederate surgeon recorded using the metal strips from barrel hoops to create splints for compound fractures. The lack of diagnostic precision had profound implications for treatment decisions. Without the ability to accurately assess internal damage, surgeons erred on the side of aggressive intervention, particularly amputation, when modern imaging might have allowed limb-saving procedures. A wound that penetrated a joint, for example, almost invariably resulted in amputation because surgeons could not visualize the extent of damage or effectively clean the joint space. Laboratory diagnostics, standard in modern medicine, were virtually non-existent. No facilities existed for analyzing blood, urine, or other bodily fluids in field hospitals. Infection was diagnosed by visual signs: redness, swelling, heat, and the presence of pus, rather than by identifying specific pathogens. This meant that different types of infections received identical treatments, regardless of the causative organism. The microscope, though available in some civilian medical schools and research facilities, was not part of battlefield medical equipment. Even if available, few military surgeons had training in microscopy or understanding of its diagnostic applications. The connection between microscopic organisms and disease was not yet widely accepted in American medicine, limiting the perceived value of such technology even among educated physicians. As the war progressed, some improvements in equipment and supplies occurred, particularly in Union hospitals. The establishment of large general hospitals in northern cities allowed for better equipment and more specialized care. By 1864, some Union general hospitals had rudimentary laboratories for basic chemical analysis and specialized surgical instruments for specific procedures. Confederate medicine, however, became increasingly primitive as the war continued. The Richmond Medical College attempted to maintain production of essential supplies, but shortages of raw materials hampered these efforts. By 1865, Confederate surgeons were operating with instruments that had been in continuous use for years, often repaired multiple times and dangerously worn. One Confederate surgeon described performing an amputation with a carpenter's saw when his medical instruments became unusable and could not be replaced. The primitive nature of Civil War medical equipment reflected the transitional state of medicine itself. The profession stood at the threshold of the modern scientific era, but had not yet embraced the germ theory or antiseptic principles that would revolutionize surgical practice. The tools in a surgeon's kit, while considered advanced for their time, represented the culmination of centuries of largely unchanged surgical practice, soon to be rendered obsolete by the medical advances that would follow in the war's wake. As dawn broke over the makeshift field hospital near Sharpsburg, Maryland on September 18, 1862, the scene that greeted medical personnel defied comprehension. The single-story farmhouse and surrounding barn had been transformed into a processing facility for humans suffering on an industrial scale. Blood-soaked straw carpeted the ground where hundreds of wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder, their groans forming a constant backdrop to the surgeon's work. The Battle of Antietam, fought just hours earlier, had produced over 23,000 casualties in a single day, the bloodiest day in American history. Field hospitals during the Civil War bore little resemblance to the organized medical facilities of later conflicts. They were improvised spaces commandeered out of necessity, churches with pews removed to make room for the wounded, barns with operating tables fashioned from doors laid across hay bales, plantation houses with elegant dining rooms converted to amputation stations. During the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, one Union medical officer described converting a Virginia church. "We removed the pulpit and pews, laying them in the churchyard. The floor was covered with straw, quickly soaked through with blood and other fluids. The altar became our supply table, holding dressings, chloroform, and instruments. These makeshift facilities offered minimal protection from the elements. Summer heat turned them into sweltering chambers where flies swarmed over open wounds, and surgeons worked stripped to their undershirts, sweat dripping onto their patients. Winter brought its own torments as poorly insulated structures left the wounded shivering under inadequate blankets. During the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862, temperatures dropped so low that water froze in buckets beside operating tables, while surgeons worked with numbed fingers by candlelight. Rain transformed field hospitals into quagmires. At Chancellorsville, a spring downpour collapsed several hospital tents, drenching patients already suffering from shock and blood loss. The red-tinged mud around busy field hospitals became so churned with blood that one Confederate surgeon described it as a paste that clung to our boots and spattered our trousers as we moved between cases. This environment made infection inevitable, as every surface teemed with bacteria from soil, animal waste, and human fluids. The proximity to active battlefields added another layer of danger. Field hospitals were marked with yellow flags, but these identifications offered inconsistent protection. During the Battle of Gettysburg, several field hospitals came under artillery fire, forcing medical personnel to evacuate patients multiple times. A Union medical director recorded moving the same group of wounded 3 times in a single day as battle lines shifted, each movement causing fresh bleeding and additional suffering. Illumination in these facilities came primarily from candles, oil lamps, and occasionally calcium lights for night operations. The lighting was woefully inadequate, casting ominous shadows that complicated delicate procedures. Surgeons frequently operated by touch as much as sight, particularly when extracting bullets or bone fragments from deep wounds. One Union surgeon described performing a facial reconstruction, more by feel than vision, as the candlelight was insufficient to illuminate the wound cavity. The sensory assault within these spaces was overwhelming. The metallic smell of blood mingled with the stench of gangrene, unwashed bodies, and overflowing waste buckets. Soundscapes featured a cacophony of human suffering, moans, screams, prayers, and delirious ramblings, punctuated by the scrape of saws against bone and the clatter of discarded limbs being tossed into growing piles outside. A hospital steward at Gettysburg wrote that the sounds and smells haunted my dreams for years afterward. No man who spent a day in those charnel houses could ever forget what war truly means. Within this chaotic environment, medical personnel faced the crushing burden of triage, determining which patients to treat first and which might survive long enough to wait. The modern color-coded triage system did not exist. Decisions were made through quick visual assessments and hurried palpations. After major battles, these choices became brutally utilitarian. A Confederate surgeon at Shiloh admitted in his diary, "We were forced to pass by men with grievous but survivable wounds to attend those for whom immediate intervention meant the difference between life and death. The choices haunt me still. The magnitude of casualties regularly overwhelmed available medical resources. Following the Battle of Antietam, approximately 17,000 wounded required treatment, but the Army of the Potomac had only about 200 medical officers available. This meant each surgeon was responsible for dozens, sometimes hundreds of patients. The mathematics was unforgiving. Even working continuously, no surgeon could adequately treat so many wounded in time to prevent massive loss of life. At Gettysburg, where over 27,000 wounded men required care, the imbalance was even more pronounced. The small Pennsylvania town, with a peacetime population of just 2,400, suddenly needed to accommodate the medical needs of an enormous casualty population. Every public building and many private homes were pressed into service as hospitals, yet thousands still lay in the open air awaiting attention. Union Surgeon Major Jonathan Letterman reported that his medical staff worked for 72 consecutive hours without rest following the battle, with many surgeons performing operations until they collapsed from exhaustion. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of inadequate medical preparation. As Union forces retreated, many wounded were left behind, some lying on the battlefield for days before receiving any care. The disorganization was so complete that some wounded were not discovered until nearly a week after the battle, having survived on rainwater and whatever food they could reach. This disaster prompted significant reforms in the Union Army Medical Department, but the fundamental problem of overwhelming numbers persisted throughout the war. The need to process large numbers of wounded quickly led to assembly line approaches to surgery. At field hospitals after major engagements, surgeons often specialized in specific procedures rather than treating individual patients comprehensively. One surgeon might perform amputations exclusively, while another extracted bullets, and a third debrided enclosed wounds. This system, while efficient, further dehumanized patient care, reducing men to collections of injuries rather than individuals. A Union medical officer described the process after the Battle of Chancellorsville. We established 3 operating tables, each with a dedicated surgeon. The first performed amputations, the second extracted missiles, and the third managed less severe wounds. Patients were brought to the appropriate table based on their injuries, treated, and then moved to recovery areas. In this manner, we processed over 200 cases in 18 hours. The physical toll on medical personnel was extreme. Many surgeons performed operations continuously for 48-72 hours after major battles, stopping only when physically unable to continue. A Confederate surgeon after the Battle of Chickamauga wrote that he performed 76 major operations in a 52-hour period, finally stopping when my hands shook so severely I could no longer hold my instruments safely. Assistant surgeons often fared worse, standing for similar periods holding retractors or assisting with amputations until they collapsed from exhaustion. The repetitive nature of battlefield surgery created its own physical demands. Amputations required significant upper body strength, particularly when cutting through thigh bones with hand-powered saws. Surgeons developed specific muscle fatigue and injuries from these repetitive motions. One Union medical officer reported that after performing 11 consecutive above-knee amputations, my right arm was so swollen and painful I could not raise it above shoulder height for several days afterward. Sleep deprivation compounded these physical challenges. During the 7 days battles outside Richmond in 1862, Confederate surgeons worked in shifts, but still averaged only 2-3 hours of sleep per night for over a week. This exhaustion led to decreased surgical precision, poor decision-making, and increased mortality among patients treated later in battle sequences. Union surgeon John Brinton observed that the quality of surgical care declined markedly after the first 36 hours of continuous operation, yet necessity demanded we continue despite our compromised capabilities. Nutrition for medical staff during these intense periods was often as inadequate as their rest. Meals were irregular and hastily consumed, typically consisting of hardtack, salt pork, and coffee when available. During the Wilderness Campaign, one medical unit reported operating for 3 days with only coffee and hardtack to sustain them. The combination of physical exertion, sleep deprivation, and poor nutrition left medical personnel vulnerable to the same diseases afflicting their patients, particularly typhoid and dysentery. The psychological burden of battlefield medicine created invisible wounds among medical staff that often went unacknowledged. Surgeons faced impossible ethical dilemmas daily, deciding which patients might benefit from limited resources and which were beyond help. These decisions, made hundreds of times during major battles, exacted a tremendous mental toll. A Union surgeon who served at Fredericksburg wrote to his wife, "I have become a different man in these months of service." The weight of so many lives balanced against so little time and resource has hardened something within me that I fear may never soften again. The constant exposure to suffering and death created what modern clinicians would recognize as acute stress reactions and post-traumatic stress. Medical personnel developed various coping mechanisms, from emotional detachment to alcohol use. A hospital steward at Cold Harbor observed that many surgeons began their day with whiskey and ended it the same way, seeking oblivion from the horrors they had both witnessed and, by necessity, inflicted. The need to treat wounded from both armies added another layer of complexity to battlefield medicine. After major battles, field hospitals typically contained a mix of Union and Confederate wounded, often lying side by side. Military medical ethics, derived from the earlier Napoleonic Wars, dictated that care be provided based on medical need rather than uniform color, but implementing this principle tested the humanity of medical staff, who had often lost friends and colleagues to enemy fire. A Union surgeon at Gettysburg recorded treating a Confederate officer who had killed several of his regiment earlier in the day. "I dressed his wounds with the same care I would give our own men, though I confess it required all my professional discipline to do so." Confederate physicians faced similar challenges, particularly as Southern resources dwindled, and providing equal care to Union prisoners meant depriving their own men of scarce supplies. The situation was particularly acute in Confederate field hospitals during the later war years. As blockades tightened and resources dwindled, Confederate surgeons faced increasingly desperate conditions. After the Battle of Atlanta in 1864, Confederate Medical Director Samuel Stout reported having to choose between treating his own severely wounded men and Union prisoners with more survivable injuries. "We had chloroform enough for perhaps 1 in 5 operations." The decision of who received this mercy and who endured the knife while conscious fell to me, a burden no physician should bear. The plight of African American soldiers added another dimension to triage challenges. Black troops in the Union Army, particularly early in their service, often received lower priority for medical care than their white counterparts. After the Battle of Fort Wagner in July 1863, wounded men from the 54th Massachusetts Infantry waited significantly longer for treatment than white soldiers with comparable injuries. As one surgeon candidly admitted in his journal, prejudices do not disappear simply because men don medicine chests rather than cartridge boxes. As the war progressed, both armies developed more sophisticated evacuation and treatment systems, somewhat alleviating the worst triage dilemmas. The Union Army's Ambulance Corps, established in August 1862 under Jonathan Letterman's direction, significantly improved the speed with which wounded were removed from battlefields. This more efficient evacuation spread casualties among multiple hospitals rather than overwhelming the closest facilities. Similarly, the development of specialized hospitals for specific types of wounds helped distribute the patient load more effectively. By 1863, the Union had established facilities dedicated to treating particular injuries: hospitals for head wounds in Alexandria, Virginia, for chest wounds in Nashville, and for orthopedic cases in Philadelphia. This specialization improved outcomes and reduced the burden on field hospitals, though it came too late for thousands who died in the war's early years. The Confederate Medical Service attempted similar innovations, but lacked the resources to implement them fully. Confederate Surgeon General Samuel Moore established a hospital classification system that designated certain facilities for specific wound types, but transportation limitations and the increasing Union occupation of Southern territory made this system difficult to maintain. By 1864, Confederate medical directors often focused simply on evacuating wounded as Union forces advanced, with systematic triage becoming a luxury they could rarely afford. Despite these improvements, the fundamental problem remained. The industrial scale of Civil War combat consistently generated more casualties than medical services could adequately address. The resulting triage decisions and battlefield conditions created physical and psychological burdens that would forever change those who served in the medical departments of both armies. As one Union surgeon wrote after the war, "We did what we could with what we had, but it was never enough." That knowledge is the heaviest burden any physician can carry. The most pernicious killer on Civil War battlefields wasn't the mini-A ball or artillery shell, but microscopic organisms completely invisible to the medical practitioners of the era. Hospital gangrene, as surgeons called it, claimed far more lives than initial wounds, creating a secondary epidemic that ravaged field hospitals with ruthless efficiency. Medical records from both armies tell a grim story. Approximately 60% of Civil War deaths resulted from disease rather than direct combat trauma. Of those who survived their initial wounds, infection claimed a staggering proportion. In the Army of the Potomac, surgeons documented that for every 1,000 amputations performed, between 250 and 300 patients died from subsequent infections rather than operative complications. Confederate statistics, though less systematically maintained, suggested even higher infection-related mortality rates as the war progressed and supplies dwindled. Hospital gangrene presented with distinctive and horrifying symptoms that haunted medical staff. Initially appearing as a small dark spot on a healing wound, the infection spread with alarming speed. Within 48 hours, healthy pink tissue would transform into a gray-green mass of putrefaction. The process released a distinctive sickly sweet odor that experienced surgeons could identify immediately upon entering a hospital tent. As the infection progressed, it dissolved tissue with terrifying efficiency, exposing bones, blood vessels, and tendons, while the patient remained conscious and in excruciating pain. A Union surgeon at City Point, Virginia, described a particularly virulent case. The patient arrived with a minor thigh wound that seemed to be healing appropriately. By morning rounds the following day, gangrene had appeared at the wound edges. Despite our interventions, within 3 days the infection had exposed the femoral artery and dissolved much of the surrounding muscle. The man remained lucid throughout his decline, aware of his body being consumed before his eyes. The physical environment of Civil War field hospitals created perfect conditions for bacterial proliferation. Operating tables, typically wooden doors or planks, absorbed blood, pus, and other bodily fluids that could not be adequately cleaned between patients. After a day of heavy use, these surfaces became thoroughly contaminated. A medical inspector visiting a field hospital after Gettysburg noted that the operating tables were so saturated with blood that they appeared to have been painted red, with pools collecting in the depressions worn into the wood. The floors of these makeshift facilities created equally dangerous reservoirs of infection. Straw was commonly spread across dirt floors to absorb blood and provide minimal comfort for patients placed directly on the ground. This sodden material was rarely changed during active battle periods due to time constraints and limited supplies. At Fredericksburg, a hospital steward recorded that the straw in their church-turned-hospital had not been changed for 6 days despite being thoroughly soaked with blood and other effluvia, creating a slippery surface that squelched underfoot and released a miasma of putrefaction with every step. Bandages and dressings presented another vector for infection transmission. Chronic shortages forced medical personnel to reuse these materials, often with minimal cleaning between applications. The standard practice involved collecting soiled bandages, washing them in cold water to remove visible blood and pus, hanging them to dry, and then reapplying them to new patients. This process did nothing to eliminate bacteria and often spread pathogens from one wound to another. The shortage became so acute that the Confederate Medical Department issued a circular in 1863 instructing surgeons to recover bandages from the dead before burial. A Confederate surgeon in Tennessee reported, "We unwrap the dressings from the deceased, rinse them in water, and apply them to the newly wounded. The men know this practice occurs and watch with apprehension as we approach with these reclaimed dressings, but we have no alternatives to offer them." Union hospitals, though better supplied, faced similar challenges during major engagements. After Antietam, even the well-organized Army of the Potomac exhausted its bandage supply within 36 hours. Medical officers resorted to tearing sheets, shirts, and other cloth items into strips for wound dressings. These improvised materials, manufactured for purposes other than medical use, often introduced additional contaminants into wounds. The disposal of amputated limbs created another source of infection. The volume of human remains generated during major battles overwhelmed normal disposal procedures. Limbs were typically collected in piles outside field hospitals, creating macabre monuments to the surgeon's work. After the Battle of Fair Oaks in 1862, a Union medical officer reported a pile of limbs higher than a man could reach outside the division hospital. These collections of decomposing tissue attracted flies and other insects that moved freely between the discarded limbs and the open wounds of the living. Burial details were assigned to dispose of these remains, but they prioritized whole bodies over amputated parts. During hot weather, limbs began decomposing within hours. A hospital steward at Second Bull Run recorded that the pile of legs and arms behind the hospital had begun to emit a powerful stench by evening of the first day. yet they remained unburied for 3 days as all available hands were needed for care of the living. Some surgeons attempted to address this problem by designating specific areas for limb disposal or by creating deeper disposal pits, but the overwhelming volume during major engagements made proper management nearly impossible. After Cold Harbor, where Union forces suffered over 7,000 casualties in a single day, amputated limbs were simply tossed out the windows and doors of field hospitals, creating a hazardous obstacle course that medical personnel had to navigate while transporting the wounded. The water supply for Civil War field hospitals frequently contributed to infection spread. Hospitals were typically established near water sources for convenience, but these same streams and ponds often served multiple purposes. Upstream from medical facilities, soldiers used waterways for bathing, laundering clothes, watering horses, and sometimes as informal latrines. This contaminated water was then used downstream for cleaning wounds, washing instruments, and preparing food for patients. During the Peninsula Campaign, a Union medical director observed that the stream supplying their field hospital ran brown with silt and organic matter after rainfalls, yet it remained their only water source. He wrote, "We attempt to filter the water through cloth before using it for wound irrigation, but this removes only the visible contaminants. That invisible factors in the water contribute to wound putrefaction seems likely, yet we have no alternative supply." The pharmaceutical options for treating infection remained extremely limited throughout the war. Without understanding bacterial causes, treatments focused on symptoms rather than underlying pathogens. Whiskey served as both anesthetic and presumed anti-infective agent, administered internally and sometimes applied directly to wounds. A typical prescription for an infected wound might include whiskey, 4 ounces every 4 hours, and whiskey compresses applied to the wound site. The medical theory behind alcohol's use combined elements of stimulant therapy with the observation that alcohol seemed to preserve biological specimens. If alcohol prevented meat from putrefying in storage, physicians reasoned it might prevent human tissue from putrefying after injury. This logic, while understandable given the scientific knowledge of the time, provided little actual benefit to infected patients beyond mild pain relief. Quinine derived from cinchona bark was another mainstay of Civil War pharmacopoeia. Though effective against malaria, surgeons prescribed it for nearly every febrile condition, including wound infections. The standard dosing involved 1 to 3 grains administered several times daily, often dissolved in whiskey to mask its intensely bitter taste. While quinine had no effect on bacterial infections, its antipyretic properties sometimes temporarily reduced fever, creating the illusion of improvement. Mercury compounds, particularly calomel, represented a third major category of anti-infective treatments. Physicians believed mercury restored balance to bodily systems and prescribed it for conditions ranging from diarrhea to syphilis to wound infections. A typical prescription might read, calomel, 10 grains twice daily until purging occurs, reflecting the belief that mercury's purgative effects helped expel disease-causing elements from the body. The reality, however, was that mercury compounds often caused more harm than good. Patients frequently developed symptoms of mercury poisoning, including excessive salivation, gingival inflammation, tooth loss, and neurological disturbances. A Union surgeon at Harrison's Landing observed that many men under treatment for infected wounds now suffer additionally from mercury's effects. Their mouths run constantly with thin saliva, their gums bleed at the slightest touch, and some have lost teeth that were previously sound. Beyond these 3 mainstays, surgeons employed various other substances believed to combat infection. Bromine solution gained popularity in Union hospitals after surgeon Middleton Goldsmith published a treatise on its use against hospital gangrene in 1863. Applied directly to infected wounds, bromine caused intense pain but showed some efficacy, likely due to its caustic action destroying both infected tissue and some bacteria. Iron compounds, particularly ferric subsulfate, were used as both styptics and anti-infectives. The solution was applied directly to wound surfaces, forming a hard crust that temporarily sealed the area. While effective at stopping hemorrhage, The crust often trapped purulent material beneath it, creating ideal conditions for anaerobic bacteria to flourish. Plant-derived treatments supplemented the limited pharmaceutical options, particularly in Confederate hospitals where conventional medicines grew scarce. Surgeons used poultices of various botanical materials, including oak bark, slippery elm, and flaxseed. These preparations provided some symptomatic relief, but offered little defense against established infections. As the war progressed, some surgeons began recognizing patterns in infection development that hinted at contagion theories, even without understanding specific bacterial causes. In 1863, Confederate Surgeon General Samuel Moore issued a directive recommending that gangrene cases be isolated from other wounded. The order noted that experience suggests hospital gangrene may pass from one patient to another through some unknown agency. Prudence dictates separating such cases from those with clean wounds. This primitive understanding of contagion led to some improved practices in the war's later years. Some hospitals designated specific wards for infected cases and assigned dedicated staff who did not rotate to other areas. Others implemented crude hand-washing protocols between patient contacts. A Union hospital in Nashville required medical staff to wash hands in a solution of potassium permanganate after treating infected cases, a practice that likely provided some benefit despite being based on miasmatic rather than germ theory. Ventilation became increasingly recognized as important for preventing hospital diseases. Union Surgeon General William Hammond directed that hospitals maintain specific cubic feet of airspace per patient and that windows remain open when weather permitted. While these measures were intended to prevent miasmatic, bad air, they inadvertently reduced airborne bacterial load in crowded wards. The communicable diseases that swept through military hospitals created additional challenges for already compromised patients. Dysentery, known colloquially as the Tennessee Quickstep or Virginia Gallop, affected nearly every soldier at some point during the war. For wounded men with already depleted reserves, the dehydration caused by dysentery often proved fatal. Hospital gangs assigned to emptying bedpans and latrines frequently spread the disease from patient to patient through inadequate hand hygiene. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi bacteria, created periodic epidemics in military hospitals. The disease spread through contaminated water and food, particularly in facilities where kitchen areas adjoin patient wards. Wounded men who contracted typhoid faced mortality rates approaching 30%, as their bodies fought a two-front war against both infection and trauma. Smallpox presented perhaps the most feared complication in military hospitals. Both armies attempted vaccination programs, but coverage remained incomplete. When smallpox appeared in a hospital ward, the consequences were devastating. The disease spread rapidly in crowded conditions, and medical personnel faced agonizing decisions about isolating infected patients, often in woefully inadequate facilities. At Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, the Confederacy's largest medical facility, a smallpox outbreak in winter 1863 forced the creation of an isolation camp nearly a mile from the main hospital. A nurse described the scene. The infected were housed in tents despite the cold, as we had nowhere else to place them. Many died not from the disease itself but from exposure, as we had insufficient blankets and fuel to keep them warm. Those of us assigned to the smallpox camp were forbidden from returning to the main hospital, creating a colony of the infected and their caretakers. The cumulative effect of these infections created a distinctive psychological burden for both patients and medical staff. Wounded men watched with dread as hospital gangrene spread through their wards, knowing their recently bandaged wounds might be next to develop the telltale dark spots. A Pennsylvania soldier recovering at Harewood Hospital wrote home, "3 men in my ward have developed gangrene this week. The surgeons come twice daily to inspect our wounds, and we watch their faces for any sign of concern that might indicate our turn has come." For medical personnel, the relentless progression of infection despite their best efforts created profound frustration. An assistant surgeon at Fortress Monroe confided to his journal, "We amputate to prevent gangrene, yet it appears in the stumps. We isolate infected cases, yet new ones develop. We try every remedy from bromine to turpentine, yet the mortality remains appalling. One cannot escape the feeling that we are fighting an enemy we cannot see and barely understand. This invisible enemy would ultimately claim far more lives than bullets or shells, transforming minor wounds into death sentences and creating a secondary epidemic that followed in the wake of every major battle. Not until the post-war period would American medicine begin to understand the bacterial causes of these infections and develop effective preventive measures. For Civil War surgeons and their patients, infection remained a mysterious and implacable foe, as much a part of the battlefield experience as the sound of artillery or the smell of gunpowder. The Civil War marked a pivotal transition in the history of combat injuries. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, few medical officers recognized they were entering an era where advances in weaponry had far outpaced developments in surgical care. The weapons that would fill field hospitals with unprecedented casualties represented a quantum leap in destructive capability, creating wounds unlike anything documented in previous American conflicts. The Mini-A ball, adopted by both armies as their standard rifle ammunition, transformed the nature of battlefield injuries. Unlike the smooth, round musket balls of earlier wars, the Mini-A ball was a conical lead projectile with a hollow base that expanded when fired, engaging the rifling of the barrel. This design dramatically increased both range and accuracy, but its effect on human tissue proved catastrophic. Weighing approximately 1 ounce and traveling at roughly 1,000 feet per second, these projectiles delivered substantially more kinetic energy than their predecessors. When a Mini-A ball struck bone, it rarely produced a clean break. Instead, the soft lead deformed on impact, creating a mushroom effect that shattered bone into dozens of fragments. Dr. Julian Chisholm, a Confederate surgeon, documented this phenomenon after the Battle of Seven Pines. The femur, when struck midshaft by the conical ball, did not merely break as one might snap a stick, but rather exploded into innumerable fragments, some no larger than grains of sand. These bone fragments themselves became secondary projectiles, shredding surrounding muscle and vessels. The wound channels created by these projectiles defied conventional treatment. Entry wounds appeared deceptively small, often just half an inch in diameter, while exit wounds might measure 3 inches across, with ragged edges and extensive tissue avulsion. More frequently, however, the Mini-A ball remained lodged in the body after spending its energy-destroying internal structures. One Union surgeon described extracting a deformed bullet that had pancaked to the size of a $50 after striking the iliac crest of a soldier at Spotsylvania. The tissue damage extended far beyond the visible wound track. The hydraulic pressure wave created by the bullet's passage caused extensive damage to structures that hadn't been directly contacted by the projectile. Blood vessels and nerves several centimeters from the wound path often ceased functioning due to this cavitation effect. Surgeons frequently noted that tissues surrounding the wound track appeared pulped or devitalized, despite no direct contact with the bullet, a phenomenon not observed with the lower velocity projectiles of previous conflicts. Arterial injuries proved particularly devastating. The pressure wave from Mini-A balls frequently ruptured major vessels, even when the projectile passed nearby without direct contact. At Chancellorsville, a Union medical officer documented a case where the femoral artery had been severed, though the ball's path was nearly an inch distant from the vessel itself. These injuries often resulted in rapid exsanguination on the battlefield before medical assistance could arrive. For those who survived long enough to reach field hospitals, arterial hemorrhage presented surgeons with nearly impossible challenges. The technical capabilities for vascular repair simply did not exist. Attempts at arterial ligation, tying off damaged blood vessels, frequently failed due to the extensive surrounding tissue damage and inevitable infection. A surgeon at Fredericksburg described attempting to ligate a damaged brachial artery. The vessel wall was so compromised by the ball's passage that sutures simply tore through the tissue like wet paper. After 3 failed attempts at repair, amputation became the only viable option to prevent the patient's death from hemorrhage. This pattern repeated thousands of times across every major engagement. Wounds that modern vascular surgery might salvage became death sentences or resulted in amputations. Medical records from both armies indicate that approximately 70% of major extremity arterial injuries resulted in either death or amputation. The remaining 30% typically involved smaller vessels, where collateral circulation proved sufficient to maintain tissue viability. Bone injuries from these conical projectiles proved equally challenging. The comminuted fractures, bones shattered into multiple fragments, defied the standard splinting techniques effective for the cleaner breaks seen in civilian practice. At Gettysburg, a surgeon with the Army of the Potomac observed that setting such fractures was virtually impossible. The bone exists no longer as a continuous structure, but as a collection of fragments contained within a sack of damaged muscle. One might as well attempt to reconstruct a vase that has been struck with a hammer. The contamination of these wounds further complicated treatment. The Minié ball, despite its increased velocity, traveled slowly enough to carry clothing fibers, dirt, and other debris into the wound. Cotton and wool uniform fibers, saturated with sweat and ground soil, introduced bacteria deep into tissue spaces. A Confederate surgeon at Shiloh noted extracting fragments of uniform cloth, a brass button, and what appeared to be straw from a single thigh wound before attempting to address the underlying vascular and bone injuries. Facial wounds presented particularly horrific challenges. The Minié ball's tendency to deform on impact created devastating injuries when striking the facial bones. The thin bones of the maxilla, orbit, and mandible offered minimal resistance, resulting in extensive fragmentation and tissue loss. A medical officer at Cold Harbor described a soldier whose entire midface from upper lip to forehead had been obliterated by a single ball, leaving only the eyes and lateral portions of the jaw intact. Such patients, if they survived, faced lifelong disfigurement in an era before effective reconstructive surgery. The psychological impact of facial wounds created additional suffering. Unlike extremity injuries that could be concealed under clothing, facial disfigurement marked survivors permanently. Hospital records note numerous cases of severe depression and suicide attempts among patients with extensive facial trauma. A nurse at Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond recorded that patients with severe facial wounds frequently requested curtains around their beds to shield themselves from the gaze of others, and often refused family visits out of shame at their appearance. Abdominal wounds proved almost uniformly fatal. Without antibiotics, blood products, or modern surgical techniques, penetrating abdominal injuries carried mortality rates exceeding 90%. The standard treatment, if it can be called such, consisted of morphine administration and expectant management. A Union surgeon at Petersburg wrote with resignation, "For abdominal cases, we make them comfortable with opium and await the inevitable. Opening the abdominal cavity in field conditions merely hastens death." The few documented survivors of abdominal wounds typically experienced spontaneous walling off of their injuries, or had wounds limited to peripheral areas of the abdomen that avoided major vascular structures and hollow organs. In rare cases where surgeons attempted abdominal exploration, the results were almost uniformly disastrous. A Confederate surgeon who attempted to repair small intestinal perforations after the Battle of Chickamauga reported that all 7 patients who underwent the procedure died within 36 hours, compared to 3 survivors among 28 similar cases managed expectantly. Chest wounds presented a different set of challenges. Penetrating thoracic injuries that violated the pleural space resulted in pneumothorax, collapse of the lung, which 19th century medicine had few means to address. Surgeons recognized the characteristic sucking sound of air being drawn through chest wounds, but lacked effective methods to expand collapsed lungs. The standard treatment involved covering the wound with a cloth dressing secured on 3 sides, an early version of what would later be called a flutter valve dressing, and administering opium to suppress coughing. Remarkably, some thoracic wounds proved more survivable than abdominal injuries. A Union medical director observed that men with chest wounds who survive the first 48 hours frequently recover, albeit with diminished pulmonary capacity. This relative survivability resulted from the lungs' significant reserve capacity and the chest cavity's relative resistance to infection compared to the peritoneum. Nevertheless, many survivors of thoracic injuries developed empyema, infection of the pleural space, or chronic bronchitis that plagued them for life. Joint wounds created particularly difficult management decisions. The synovial cavities of major joints, once violated by projectiles, almost invariably became infected in the pre-antiseptic era. Knee wounds proved especially dangerous, with mortality rates approaching 60% when managed conservatively. The alternative, amputation, offered better survival odds but guaranteed lifelong disability. This terrible calculus forced surgeons to make rapid judgments about cases where either option seemed inhumane. A surgeon with the Army of Tennessee described this dilemma after Stones River. A young lieutenant arrived with a mini-A ball lodged in his knee joint. The capsule had been violated, but the major vessels remained intact. I explained that amputation offered his best chance of survival, while attempting to preserve the limb carried greater risk of death. He chose to keep his leg, stating he would rather die whole than live maimed. He developed septicemia on the 4th day and died on the 7th, a pattern I have witnessed dozens of times. The psychological trauma of these wounds extended far beyond the immediate physical injury. Civil War soldiers suffering from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder received little understanding or treatment. Medical records frequently describe irritable heart, soldier's heart, or nostalgia as diagnoses for what were likely psychological responses to combat trauma. These conditions were generally attributed to moral weakness or cowardice, rather than recognized as legitimate medical conditions. Survivors of severe wounds often developed chronic pain syndromes that modern medicine would classify as neuropathic pain. Without effective analgesics beyond opium and alcohol, many veterans became dependent on these substances. Pension records from the post-war period document thousands of veterans who developed opium addiction following their injuries. A physician examining pension applicants in 1875 noted that many applicants show signs of chronic opium use, including pinpoint pupils, malnourishment, and characteristic skin lesions. When questioned, most attribute their initial use to pain from war wounds. Physical disabilities from survivable wounds created enormous social and economic challenges for veterans. In an era of primarily manual labor, the loss of a limb or significant function often meant inability to support oneself or one's family. While both governments established pension systems for disabled veterans, the payments rarely provided adequate support. A study of New York veterans conducted in 1880 found that amputees had unemployment rates nearly 4 times higher than unwounded veterans and earned approximately 60% less when employed. The long-term complications of seemingly survivable wounds frequently emerged months or years after the initial injury. Osteomyelitis, chronic bone infection, developed in approximately 25% of veterans with significant bone injuries. This condition caused persistent drainage, pain, and occasional acute exacerbations requiring additional surgery. Medical records from post-war veterans homes document patients undergoing multiple operations decades after their initial injuries, as bone fragments and sequestra continued to work their way to the surface. Foreign body retention created another source of chronic complications. Without radiographic imaging, surgeons often missed bullet fragments, clothing fibers, or bone shards during initial wound treatment. These materials served as persistent sources of inflammation and infection. An 1888 medical journal article documented the case of a veteran who had suffered a thigh wound at Gettysburg in 1863. 25 years later, he developed acute inflammation at the healed wound site. Surgical exploration revealed a section of wool uniform cloth approximately 2 inches square, remarkably preserved and encapsulated in fibrous tissue. Neurological injuries created some of the most debilitating long-term conditions. Peripheral nerve lacerations resulted in permanent paralysis and sensory loss. More insidious were cases where bullets passed near, but did not directly transect major nerve trunks. The pressure wave often caused demyelination an internal disruption of nerve architecture while leaving the nerve macroscopically intact. Patients with such injuries developed progressive symptoms, as scarring and fibrosis compressed the damaged nerves over time. By the 1880s, specialized veterans' home wards housed thousands of former soldiers with paralyzed limbs, chronic pain syndromes, and causalgia. The devastating nature of these wounds transformed American medicine. Army surgeon Charles Tripler observed in 1864 that the war has compressed a century of surgical experience into 3 bloody years. The sheer volume of casualties and the unique patterns of injury created by industrial-age weapons forced rapid adaptation of medical techniques and eventually led to significant advances in trauma care, amputation methods, and wound management. For the men who experienced these wounds, however, such future advances provided little comfort. They had encountered a preview of 20th century warfare while being treated with 18th century medical techniques, a lethal disparity that cost thousands their lives and left many more permanently maimed. A veteran writing in 1883 perhaps captured this tragic disconnect most succinctly. The weapons that struck us down belonged to the future. The hands that tried to mend us belonged to the past. We broken men exist as living testimony to the cost of this gap. By the summer of 1863, the fields surrounding major military hospitals had developed a grim signature: enormous pits filled with discarded human limbs. At Letterman Hospital after Gettysburg, medical personnel dug trenches 6 feet deep and 20 feet long solely for the disposal of amputated arms and legs. The sheer volume was staggering. Throughout the 4 years of conflict, Union and Confederate surgeons performed approximately 60,000 amputations, earning them the derisive nickname "sawbones" from the men who feared their blades. The scale of this surgical intervention was unprecedented in American history. In the Army of the Potomac alone, surgeons amputated more than 200 limbs daily during the week following the Battle of Chancellorsville. At Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, the Confederacy's largest medical facility, administrators designated specific wards as amputation recovery areas, where rows of beds contained men at various stages of post-surgical recovery, their stumps wrapped in blood-soaked dressings. The medical reasoning behind amputation as the primary treatment for limb wounds was grounded in hard-earned battlefield experience. Early in the war, surgeons attempted to preserve limbs with severe bone and vascular damage, particularly when the patient was a high-ranking officer or from a prominent family. The results proved catastrophic. At first Bull Run, Union surgeons tried conservative management for 11 cases of compound femur fractures from mini-A ball wounds. All 11 patients developed rampant infection, and 9 died from septicemia within 2 weeks. By contrast, immediate amputation for similar injuries yielded survival rates approaching 70% when performed within the first 24 hours after injury. The statistics were compelling and shaped surgical decision-making throughout the conflict. Medical directors on both sides issued guidelines emphasizing that compound fractures of major long bones, especially with arterial involvement, should be treated with primary amputation rather than attempted reconstruction. Confederate Surgeon General Samuel Moore circulated a memorandum in 1862 stating, "Experience has proven that conservative management of compound fractures, particularly those involving the femur and caused by conical bullets, results in mortality rates exceeding 80%. Primary amputation, while regrettable, offers the patient the greatest chance of survival." The timing of amputation proved critical to patient outcomes. Surgeons recognized distinct categories: primary amputations performed within 24 hours of injury, intermediate amputations performed during the period of inflammation, and secondary amputations performed after inflammation had subsided. Statistics compiled by the Union Army Medical Department showed that primary amputations of the thigh carried a 28% mortality rate, while intermediate amputations of the same region resulted in 74% mortality. This stark difference created tremendous pressure on surgeons to operate quickly, often before adequate preparations could be made. After major engagements, the imperative for rapid intervention led to assembly line approaches to amputation. At field hospitals following the Battle of Antietam, surgeons established dedicated amputation stations where they performed the procedures continuously, sometimes completing a limb removal in under 5 minutes from first incision to final bandaging. The technique itself had been refined through brutal experience. Early in the war, many surgeons used the circular method of amputation, which involved cutting straight through all tissues at the same level. As the conflict progressed, most adopted the flap method, which preserved flaps of skin and muscle tissue that could be used to cover the bone end, creating a more functional stump. The procedure followed a standard sequence: application of tourniquets, creation of skin flaps, division of muscle tissue, sawing through bone at a level higher than the muscle cut, ligating major vessels, trimming the bone ends smooth, and suturing the flaps over the stump. Speed was essential not just for managing the volume of casualties, but for minimizing shock and pain for the patient. Without modern anesthesia monitoring, prolonged operations increased mortality. Experienced surgeons prided themselves on their speed. Dr. Julian John Chisholm, a prominent Confederate surgeon, wrote that a competent operator should complete a thigh amputation in under 4 minutes from the first incision to the tying of the final vessel. This emphasis on speed necessarily came at the expense of precision. Surgeons worked with blood-slicked hands, often in poor light, moving from one patient to the next with minimal breaks. Physical fatigue inevitably affected performance. A Union medical officer at Gettysburg noted that after 20 consecutive amputations, my hand had begun to shake so severely that I feared for the safety of my patients. Yet more wounded waited, and there was no one to relieve me. The physical environment for these procedures bore little resemblance to modern operating rooms. Amputations were frequently performed on doors removed from hinges and balanced on barrels or boxes. Lighting came from candles or oil lamps, creating shadows that obscured anatomical details. During winter campaigns, surgeons operated in gloves or with hands numbed by cold, further reducing tactile sensitivity. After Fredericksburg, a medical officer reported performing amputations in a temperature so cold that the blood froze to ice on our instruments between cases. Pain management during these procedures relied primarily on chloroform, with ether as a secondary option when chloroform supplies ran short. The standard approach involved pouring chloroform onto a cloth held over the patient's face until unconsciousness occurred, typically within 30-60 seconds. This crude administration method made precise dosing impossible. Patients frequently received either too little anesthetic, becoming conscious during the procedure, or too much, risking respiratory depression and death. The Confederate Medical Service faced particularly severe challenges maintaining adequate anesthesia supplies as the Union blockade tightened. By 1863, chloroform had become so scarce in Southern hospitals that surgeons reserved it for amputations above the knee or elbow, with lesser procedures performed using whiskey as the only analgesic. A surgeon at Atlanta's Gate City Hospital recorded performing 17 forearm amputations in one day, with no anesthetic beyond a gill of whiskey per patient. Their screams could be heard throughout the hospital grounds. The psychological impact on surgeons who performed these procedures day after day was profound. Many developed what would now be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. John Brinton, a Union surgeon who later helped establish the Army Medical Museum, wrote in his memoirs, "The hardest thing was looking into the eyes of young men and telling them they must lose a limb to save their life." Some begged for alternatives that did not exist. Others stoically submitted, asking only that we save enough stump to accommodate a prosthetic. The weight of these decisions aged us all prematurely. For patients, the psychological trauma of amputation extended far beyond the physical pain. Young men who had entered military service in peak physical condition suddenly faced futures as permanent invalids in a society where manual labor predominated. A Confederate lieutenant who underwent thigh amputation after Chancellorsville wrote to his fiancée, "I return to you half the man who left. My farming days are done, and I know not how I shall support us. If you wish to release yourself from our engagement, I would understand, though it would break what remains of my heart." Post-amputation care remained primitive throughout the war. The standard dressing consisted of simple cotton or linen bandages wrapped around the stump, often secured with a small amount of adhesive plaster. Drainage was considered essential to prevent infection, so surgeons typically left portions of the incision open or inserted drainage materials such as cotton wicks or rubber tubes. Dressings were changed daily when supplies permitted, with each change causing significant pain for patients. Pain management following amputation relied heavily on opium in various forms. Morphine had been isolated in 1804, but was not widely available in purified form during the Civil War. Instead, surgeons prescribed opium pills, opium tincture, or opium and ipecac mixture. A typical order might read opium, 1 grain every 4 hours for pain, or laudanum, 20 drops as needed for rest. These medications provided inconsistent relief and carried significant side effects, including constipation, nausea, and respiratory depression. More concerning was the potential for dependence, which developed in many amputees. A post-war study of veterans from Pennsylvania found that approximately 45% of amputees continued using opiates regularly for years after their surgeries, many developing what was then called the Army disease of opiate addiction. Infection remained the greatest threat to successful recovery. Without antiseptic techniques, post-amputation infection rates approached 80%. Surgeons recognized several patterns of infectious complications, including hospital gangrene, erysipelas, and pyemia. Each carried high mortality rates despite treatment attempts with bromine solutions, silver nitrate, or iron compounds. For patients who survived the immediate post-operative period, stump revision often became necessary. Primary healing rarely occurred in field hospital amputations, leaving patients with painful, poorly healed stumps that could not tolerate prosthetic devices. A study of 100 consecutive amputees at a Union General Hospital in Philadelphia found that 61 required at least 1 revision surgery, with 27 needing multiple procedures to create a functional stump. The prosthetic options available to Civil War amputees were crude by modern standards, but represented significant innovations for the era. Prior to the war, artificial limbs were custom-made luxury items affordable only to the wealthy. The unprecedented number of military amputees created a market that drove rapid development in prosthetic technology. The U.S. government began providing artificial limbs to Union veterans in 1862, appropriating $15,000 to fund the program, the first federal initiative for prosthetic provision in American history. The most common lower extremity prosthesis was the Salem leg, a wooden device with articulated knee and ankle joints operated by catgut cords that provided rudimentary control. Upper extremity prosthetics typically consisted of a leather socket with a wooden or metal terminal device, ranging from simple hooks to more complex mechanical hands with finger flexion capabilities. These devices cost between $50 and $150, a substantial sum when the average soldier earned $13 per month. Confederate amputees faced greater challenges obtaining prosthetics as the Southern economy collapsed. The Confederate government established a modest artificial limb program in 1863, but materials shortages severely limited production. Many Southern states attempted to fill this gap through state-funded programs. Virginia established the Association for the Relief of Maimed Soldiers in 1864, which provided approximately 400 artificial limbs before the war's end, a small fraction of the estimated 6,000 Confederate amputees from that state alone. The functionality of these devices remained severely limited. Lower extremity prosthetics allowed basic ambulation on flat surfaces, but could not accommodate uneven terrain. Recipients typically required a cane or crutches for stability, and many abandoned their prosthetics as too painful or cumbersome for regular use. Upper extremity devices provided minimal functionality beyond cosmetic appearance and simple grasping actions. Fine motor control remained impossible, rendering many occupations inaccessible to arm amputees. For surgeons, the relentless demands of the amputation ward extracted a heavy psychological toll. Many developed emotional detachment as a coping mechanism, referring to patients by their injuries rather than names. A hospital steward at City Point, Virginia, observed that surgeons often used phrases like "the femur in bed 3" or the double amp by the window, rather than addressing patients personally. This detachment sometimes appeared as callousness to patients, but represented a psychological defense mechanism for medical staff facing overwhelming suffering. The physical demands proved equally taxing. Amputations required significant upper body strength, particularly when working through the thick muscles of the thigh. After major battles, surgeons performed dozens of consecutive procedures without adequate rest. A medical officer at Chattanooga reported that after 30 hours of continuous surgery, my right arm had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and I could no longer raise the amputation saw above chest height. Still, the wounded continued to arrive. The cumulative impact of these experiences changed many surgeons fundamentally. Dr. William Keene, who would later become a pioneering neurosurgeon, reflected on his Civil War service. "I entered the Army a boy of 24. I emerged a man of 40, though only 3 years had passed. The weight of thousands of decisions, which limbs to take and which men might be spared the knife, aged us all beyond our years. For the men who underwent amputation, the war never truly ended. They carried their sacrifices visibly for the remainder of their lives, with stumps that often caused phantom pain, neuromas, and recurrent infections. A study conducted by the U.S. Pension Bureau in 1885 found that 74% of surviving amputees reported chronic pain at their amputation sites, with 35% experiencing severe pain that interfered with daily activities and employment. The unprecedented scale of Civil War amputations ultimately transformed American medicine and society. Specialized hospitals for amputee rehabilitation were established in major cities, developing techniques that would influence orthopedic and rehabilitation medicine for decades. The visibility of thousands of amputee veterans in post-war America forced public recognition of war's costs and eventually led to expanded government responsibility for veterans' care. Yet for the individual surgeon standing before an operating table in a blood-soaked field hospital, these future developments provided little comfort. They faced an immediate crisis where speed meant survival, where hesitation cost lives, and where every decision to amputate, however medically necessary, permanently altered a young man's future. In those moments, with saw in hand and wounded men waiting, they carried a burden few modern practitioners can fully comprehend. The journey from battlefield to medical care proved as deadly as the wounds themselves for thousands of Civil War soldiers. In April 1862, following the Battle of Shiloh, wounded men lay scattered across the Tennessee landscape for up to 3 days before evacuation teams reached them. Many died from exposure and blood loss while awaiting transport, their bodies discovered only when the sweet, sickly smell of decomposition led stretcher bearers to their locations among the underbrush and tall grass. The rudimentary evacuation systems of both armies reflected the military's unpreparedness for the scale of industrial warfare. When the conflict began in 1861, neither the Union nor Confederate forces possessed dedicated medical transport units. The common practice involved designating musicians, cooks, and other non-combatants as ad hoc stretcher bearers during battles. These untrained personnel, often physically unfit for the demanding task, struggled to navigate difficult terrain while carrying wounded men weighing 150–200 pounds. A Union medical officer at First Bull Run described the chaotic evacuation. "Our musicians, serving as stretcher bearers, abandoned their charges when Confederate artillery began falling near the aid station. Several wounded men, deposited behind a small rise for protection, were forgotten in the general retreat and not recovered for 2 days." This pattern repeated throughout the war's early engagements, with the wounded often left to fend for themselves as battles shifted and medical personnel fled approaching enemy forces. The stretchers themselves represented the most basic technology, 2 wooden poles supporting a canvas sling, requiring 2 men to carry a single casualty. On the broken, muddy ground typical of battlefields, these simple devices proved woefully inadequate. During the Peninsula Campaign, stretcher teams sank ankle-deep in Virginia mud while attempting to transport casualties, sometimes requiring 4 men to carry a single wounded soldier. A medical officer with the Army of the Potomac noted that the standard issue stretchers frequently broke under the weight of fully equipped soldiers, depositing already traumatized men onto the ground. The physical toll on stretcher bearers was extreme. Each team typically traveled 1-3 miles from aid stations to the battlefield and back, navigating shell holes, fences, ditches, and often moving under direct fire. At Antietam, Union stretcher teams worked for 38 consecutive hours, with many bearers eventually collapsing from exhaustion. A hospital steward recorded that several of our stretcher men were found asleep on the empty stretchers, physically unable to continue despite the desperate need for their services. The danger faced by these unarmed personnel was considerable. Both armies recognized stretcher bearers as non-combatants, but in the chaos of battle, this distinction offered limited protection. At Gettysburg, 14 Union stretcher bearers were killed by artillery fire while attempting to evacuate wounded from the front lines near Cemetery Ridge. Confederate forces reported similar casualties among their evacuation teams during the 7 days battles, with one Virginia regiment losing 8 stretcher bearers killed and 17 wounded during a single afternoon of evacuation work. The first significant improvement in battlefield evacuation came with the establishment of the Union Ambulance Corps in August 1862. Under the direction of Dr. Jonathan Letterman, medical director of the Army of the Potomac, this specialized unit replaced the haphazard system of detailed musicians and cooks with trained personnel dedicated exclusively to casualty evacuation. Letterman's system assigned 3 ambulances to each regiment, with each ambulance staffed by a driver and 2 stretcher bearers. These men received specific training in loading wounded, basic first aid, and navigation of difficult terrain. The impact proved immediate. At Antietam in September 1862, Letterman's newly organized ambulance corps evacuated approximately 10,000 Union wounded within 24 hours of the battle's conclusion, an unprecedented achievement. By contrast, after Fredericksburg in December 1862, some wounded Confederate soldiers waited up to 5 days for evacuation due to the South's less developed medical transport system. The Confederate Medical Department attempted to implement similar reforms, but resource limitations hampered their efforts. By 1863, most Confederate armies had established ambulance corps on paper, but chronic shortages of wagons, horses, and trained personnel undermined their effectiveness. After Chancellorsville, Confederate Surgeon General Samuel Moore reported that his ambulance corps had only 40% of its authorized transportation assets, forcing medical officers to commandeer farm wagons and civilian vehicles to evacuate the wounded. The vehicles serving as ambulances would horrify modern medical professionals. Early in the conflict, both armies pressed ordinary supply wagons into service as casualty transport. These vehicles, designed for carrying ammunition and food supplies, had no suspension systems beyond the basic wooden chassis. Each jolt and bump transmitted directly to the wounded men inside, often causing renewed bleeding and additional trauma. A Union surgeon described the effects. Men with fractured femurs arrived at the field hospital with bone ends protruding through flesh due to the constant jarring of the ambulance wagons. Several died from hemorrhage during transport that might have been controlled had they remained stationary. Purpose-built ambulances gradually appeared in Union forces, with the 2-wheeled Coolidge and 4-wheeled Rucker ambulances becoming standard by 1863. These vehicles incorporated features specifically designed for casualty transport, including suspended stretcher racks, water casks, and compartments for medical supplies. However, even these improved designs offered minimal protection from road conditions. The Rucker ambulance could transport 4 seated patients or 2 lying down, but its leather straps supporting the stretchers provided only marginal improvement over direct contact with the wagon bed. Confederate forces rarely enjoyed access to specialized ambulance designs, relying instead on modified civilian vehicles throughout the war. By 1864, as the blockade tightened and manufacturing capacity diminished, Confederate medical reports described ambulance corps using farm carts, family carriages, and even ox-drawn sleds to transport wounded. The lack of standardization created additional challenges, as stretchers designed for military ambulances often didn't fit properly in civilian vehicles, requiring improvised securing methods that frequently failed during transport. The road networks themselves contributed significantly to transportation trauma. Civil War armies operated primarily on unpaved roads that became nearly impassable after rain. During the Mud March of January 1863, Union ambulances sank to their axles in Virginia clay, requiring teams of 6 horses to pull each vehicle. Wounded men inside these ambulances endured journeys of excruciating slowness, sometimes traveling less than 5 miles in a full day of transport. A medical officer with the Army of the Cumberland reported that after Chickamauga, some ambulance journeys to field hospitals took over 12 hours to cover just 7 miles of muddy road. The personnel driving these vehicles received minimal training. Early in the war, ambulance drivers were often selected from men considered unfit for combat duties, including those with alcohol problems or disciplinary issues. Their handling of the wounded frequently reflected this poor selection. A Union medical inspector reported observing ambulance drivers racing their vehicles as if at a sporting event, with wounded men crying out in pain at each bounce and jolt. After particularly harsh criticism following the Peninsula Campaign, the Union Army began imposing stricter standards for ambulance drivers, but Confederate forces continued struggling with personnel quality throughout the war. For wounded men, the ambulance journey represented a harrowing extension of battlefield trauma. A Pennsylvania infantry sergeant wounded at Spotsylvania described his evacuation. 4 of us were loaded into an ambulance designed for 2. My shattered arm lay across another man's chest, his leg wound bleeding onto my uniform. Every rut in the road brought fresh agony. The driver stopped twice for whiskey, leaving us baking in the summer heat. By the time we reached the field hospital, my bandages had soaked through, and the man beneath me had died from his wounds. The journey from field hospitals to larger general hospitals created another layer of transportation challenges. As both armies developed more sophisticated tiered medical systems, wounded men who survived initial treatment often faced secondary journeys of considerable distance. These evacuations utilized whatever transportation was available: ambulance wagons, supply trains returning to depots, civilian vehicles, and increasingly as the war progressed, railroad cars and steamboats. Railroad evacuation offered faster transport over longer distances, but introduced its own forms of trauma. Standard freight cars, pressed into service as medical transport, had no suspension systems or interior fittings for securing stretchers. Wounded men were typically placed on straw spread across the wooden floor, with nothing to prevent them from sliding with the train's movements. A Union medical officer described a train evacuation following the Battle of Chattanooga. The wounded lay side by side on the car floor, with orderlies attempting to wedge blankets around them to prevent movement. Despite these efforts, at each acceleration or braking, the men slid forward or backward en masse, causing fresh bleeding and dislodging bandages. By 1863, the Union Medical Department had begun converting standard boxcars into dedicated hospital cars by installing tiered wooden bunks along the walls. While an improvement over freight cars, these early hospital trains still lacked specialized suspension systems or adequate ventilation. During summer months, the temperature inside these wooden cars could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing severe discomfort to wounded men already struggling with fever and dehydration. A surgeon accompanying a hospital train from Fredericksburg to Washington in July 1863 reported that 3 patients expired from apparent heat exhaustion during the journey, their conditions exacerbated by the stifling air within the cars. The Confederate Medical Service, with more limited resources, rarely achieved even this level of specialized rail transport. As the war progressed and the Southern railway system deteriorated from Union raids and lack of maintenance, Confederate casualty evacuation by rail became increasingly problematic. After the Battle of Atlanta, wounded Confederate soldiers were transported in cattle cars so dilapidated that rain poured through the roofs, soaking bandages and bedding. A Georgia volunteer nurse described seeing men with fresh amputations lying in puddles of rainwater mixed with blood during one such evacuation. Water transport offered somewhat more comfortable evacuation for those fortunate enough to access it. By 1863, the Union Army had converted several commercial steamboats into floating hospitals, complete with proper beds, operating rooms, and medical staff. The most famous of these, the USS Red Rover, operated on the Mississippi River and could accommodate up to 200 patients in relatively humane conditions. These vessels featured proper ventilation, ice storage for preserving food and reducing fever, and even early evaporative cooling systems for patient comfort. The benefits of water evacuation were significant. The smoother transportation reduced the risk of renewed hemorrhage and fracture displacement. The stable platform allowed for ongoing medical care during transport, including dressing changes and even surgical procedures when necessary. A medical officer aboard the hospital steamer DA January reported performing 13 secondary operations during a single transport mission from Vicksburg to St. Louis in 1863, something impossible in the chaotic environment of ambulance wagons or rail cars. However, water transport remained available only to a minority of casualties. Geographic limitations restricted riverboat evacuations to troops operating near major waterways, primarily benefiting Union forces along the Mississippi River system and Atlantic coast. The vast majority of wounded from inland battles still faced evacuation by wagon and rail. Confederate forces, with their more limited naval resources and increasing Union blockade, rarely developed comparable water evacuation capabilities, though some improvised hospital boats operated on the James River and in Charleston Harbor early in the war. Even the superior conditions of hospital ships included significant hazards. Disease spread rapidly in the confined spaces below decks, with measles, dysentery, and erysipelas frequently sweeping through patient populations during transport. A surgeon aboard the hospital steamer City of Memphis documented an outbreak of hospital gangrene that infected 37 patients during a 4-day journey from Memphis to Cairo in 1864, resulting in 9 deaths and 14 emergency surgeries performed in the ship's overcrowded operating room. The most fortunate wounded were those evacuated near cities with established civilian transportation networks. After Gettysburg, some Union officers were transported to Philadelphia in regular passenger cars, with proper seats and even rudimentary dining service. A lieutenant with the 20th Maine described this journey as remarkably civilized compared to my initial evacuation, with padded seats and even ice water provided by civilian volunteers at station stops. Such experiences remained exceptional, available primarily to officers and those with minor wounds that permitted seated travel. For most of the war's wounded, the evacuation journey represented a dangerous extension of their initial trauma. A study conducted by the Union Medical Department in 1865 estimated that approximately 8% of wounded men who survived their initial injuries died during transport to general hospitals. Confederate records, though less comprehensive, suggest even higher transportation mortality rates, particularly in the war's final years, as their medical evacuation system deteriorated along with the broader Confederate infrastructure. The physical and psychological impact of these evacuation experiences lingered long after the journeys ended. Many soldiers developed chronic pain conditions attributed to improper transport of fractures and wounds. A post-war study of veterans in Massachusetts found that 22% of men with extremity wounds reported permanent complications that medical reviewers attributed to transportation trauma rather than the initial injury. These included malunited fractures, chronic wound drainage, and persistent neuralgia along compressed nerve pathways. The experiences of Civil War medical evacuation ultimately drove significant post-war innovations in ambulance design, hospital train configuration, and stretcher technology. The war's transportation challenges demonstrated the critical importance of the evacuation phase in determining final outcomes for wounded soldiers. This hard-earned knowledge would influence military medical planning for decades, though its lessons came at the cost of thousands of lives lost not to their initial wounds, but to the traumatic journey that followed. The blood-soaked battlefields of the Civil War became unexpected laboratories for medical innovation. As the conflict stretched from months into years, physicians on both sides found themselves forced to improvise, adapt, and develop new systems that would forever change American medicine. Perhaps no figure exemplified this transformation more than Dr. Jonathan Letterman, medical director of the Army of the Potomac, whose systematic approach to battlefield medicine saved countless lives and established principles still taught in modern military medicine. When Letterman assumed his position in July 1862, he inherited a medical system in chaos. Wounded men languished for days on battlefields, ambulances were commandeered by retreating soldiers, and field hospitals operated without standardization or central coordination. The disaster at the Battle of First Bull Run, where hundreds of wounded were abandoned during the Union retreat, had demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of poor medical organization. Letterman's response was revolutionary, the creation of the first comprehensive triage system in American military history. Rather than treating patients in the order they arrived or based on rank, Letterman instituted a system that categorized casualties by severity and urgency. Those with life-threatening wounds requiring immediate intervention received priority, while soldiers with less severe injuries waited. This approach, though seemingly obvious to modern medical professionals, represented a radical departure from previous practices where social standing or time of arrival often determined treatment order. The Letterman system divided casualties into three categories: those requiring immediate surgery to preserve life, those whose operations could be delayed without significant risk, and those with injuries so severe that intervention would likely prove futile. This third category, patients classified as moribund or expectant, created profound ethical challenges for Civil War surgeons. With limited resources and overwhelming casualties, physicians had to make the agonizing decision to withhold treatment from some mortally wounded men to focus on those with better chances of survival. A Union surgeon at Gettysburg described implementing this system. "We marked the foreheads of the arriving wounded with colored tags indicating priority. Those requiring immediate amputation or hemorrhage control received red tags and were taken directly to operating tables. Those with less urgent wounds received blue tags and were made comfortable until the critical cases had been addressed. Those beyond our help received black tags and were given morphine to ease their passing." The triage system spread rapidly throughout Union medical services after demonstrating dramatic improvements in survival rates. By 1863, most Union field hospitals had adopted standardized triage protocols, with dedicated assessment officers examining wounded men as they arrived and directing them to appropriate treatment areas. The Confederate Medical Department, recognizing the system's effectiveness, implemented similar protocols despite their more limited resources. Letterman's innovations extended beyond triage to the entire evacuation chain. He established a three-tiered system of care that would become the template for modern military medicine. Field dressing stations positioned close to the battle lines provided immediate hemorrhage control and stabilization. Field hospitals several miles behind the lines performed urgent surgeries and initial wound management. General hospitals in major cities offered specialized care and long-term recovery facilities. This tiered approach allowed for the most efficient use of limited medical resources. Surgeons with the greatest experience in trauma management were positioned at field hospitals where their skills saved the most lives, while physicians more suited to long-term care staffed general hospitals. Medical supplies were similarly distributed according to the specific needs of each echelon, with field dressing stations stocked primarily with bandages and tourniquets, while field hospitals received surgical instruments and anesthetics. The effectiveness of this system became evident during the Gettysburg campaign. Despite facing over 27,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting, the Union Medical Department evacuated and provided initial treatment to virtually all wounded within 24 hours of the battle's conclusion. This achievement stood in stark contrast to earlier engagements like Antietam, where wounded men had remained on the battlefield for days. Another critical innovation emerged in the form of specialized hospitals for specific injuries and diseases. Before the Civil War, hospitals treated all conditions in common wards, with little differentiation by injury type or required expertise. By 1863, the Union Army Medical Department had established dedicated facilities for particular conditions. Turner's Lane Hospital in Philadelphia specialized in neurological injuries, Judiciary Square Hospital in Washington focused on thoracic wounds, and Satterley Hospital became known for orthopedic cases. This early form of medical specialization allowed surgeons to develop expertise through repeated exposure to similar cases. At Harewood Hospital outside Washington, surgeons focusing exclusively on facial wounds developed new techniques for maxillofacial reconstruction that would have been impossible in general practice. A surgeon there performed over 200 facial reconstructions during the war, documenting specific approaches to mandibular, maxillary, and orbital injuries that informed medical practice for decades afterward. The Confederate Medical Department attempted similar specialization despite more limited resources. In Richmond, Chimborazo Hospital, the largest military hospital in North America, divided its 150 pavilions by injury type and region of origin. Specific wards were designated for head wounds, amputations, thoracic injuries, and communicable diseases. This arrangement allowed Confederate surgeons to develop specialized skills while also grouping patients from the same states together, which medical directors believed improved morale and recovery rates. The development of specialized hospitals coincided with another crucial innovation: improved medical record-keeping systems. Before the war, patient documentation consisted primarily of physicians' casebooks and personal notes, with no standardized format or centralized collection. The scale of Civil War casualties made this approach untenable and drove the development of the first comprehensive medical record system in American history. In 1862, the Union Surgeon General's office introduced standardized case report forms that physicians completed for each patient. These forms captured crucial data including wound location, treatment provided, complications, and outcomes. By war's end, the medical department had collected over 10 million document pages detailing the medical experiences of Union soldiers. This unprecedented data set provided valuable information for future medical advances and represents one of the first large-scale medical databases in history. The Confederate Medical Department implemented a similar record-keeping system, though wartime shortages often forced them to use repurposed paper, including wallpaper and the blank sides of forms from other departments. Despite these challenges, Confederate Surgeon General Samuel Moore insisted on maintaining detailed records, recognizing their scientific value. He wrote to field surgeons in 1863, "The careful documentation of your cases, gentlemen, will provide invaluable guidance to those who follow us in this profession, long after our present conflict has ended." These records proved particularly valuable for tracking outcomes of specific procedures and identifying effective treatment approaches. By analyzing amputation data from thousands of cases, military surgeons determined optimal amputation sites, timing, and techniques. This information directly influenced surgical practice during the war's later years, with the Union Medical Department issuing updated surgical guidelines based on statistical analysis of patient outcomes. Beyond these systematic changes, the war drove innovation in specific medical technologies. The urgent need for artificial limbs prompted significant advances in prosthetic design. The federal government's commitment to provide artificial limbs to all Union amputees created an unprecedented market that drove manufacturers to improve functionality and comfort. By 1864, prosthetic manufacturers were producing limbs with articulated joints, adjustable fittings, and more natural appearances than pre-war designs. Perhaps the most significant and often overlooked medical innovation of the Civil War was the emergence of female nurses as essential components of military medicine. When the war began, nursing was not considered a respectable profession for women, and military hospitals relied primarily on male stewards and convalescent patients to provide nursing care. The scale of casualties quickly rendered this system inadequate, creating opportunities for women to enter military medical service in unprecedented numbers. Dorothea Dix, appointed superintendent of Union Army nurses in 1861, established the first formal female nursing corps in American military history. Despite facing significant resistance from male physicians, Dix recruited over 3,000 women to serve in Union hospitals. Her strict selection criteria, nurses had to be plain-looking women over 30 years of age with sober dispositions, reflected the social constraints of the era, but also helped establish nursing as a respectable profession rather than merely women's natural caretaking role. The impact of these female nurses on patient care was profound. They introduced standards of hygiene and comfort, often overlooked by male medical staff, focused primarily on surgical intervention. A Union surgeon at Fortress Monroe observed that wards managed by female nurses have noticeably lower rates of infection and higher morale among patients. The women attend to details male attendants often neglect: regular bathing, clean bedding, proper feeding of the severely wounded, and the emotional support so essential to recovery. Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, exemplified the expanding role of women in military medicine. Initially working independently to deliver supplies to field hospitals, Barton gradually assumed greater responsibilities, including wound dressing, medication administration, and even assisting during surgeries. At Antietam, she worked so close to the front lines that a bullet passed through her sleeve while she was tending wounded men. Her willingness to serve in dangerous forward positions challenged conventional limitations on women's roles and demonstrated their capacity for service under the most demanding conditions. In Confederate hospitals, women played equally crucial roles despite the lack of a formal nursing corps. The Southern cultural emphasis on female domestic expertise made the transition to hospital service somewhat smoother for Confederate nurses, though they still faced resistance from some male physicians. Sally Tompkins of Richmond became the only female commissioned officer in the Confederate Army after establishing a private hospital with the war's lowest recorded mortality rate. Her commission as a captain came directly from Jefferson Davis in recognition of her exceptional medical service. The war also drove pharmaceutical innovations, as supply shortages forced medical departments to identify local substitutes for imported medicines. The Union blockade severely restricted Confederate access to conventional drugs, prompting Southern surgeons to establish botanical laboratories to process native plants with medicinal properties. Francis Porcher's Resources of the Southern Fields and Forests, published in 1863, identified local substitutes for unavailable medicines, including willow bark for salicylic acid, dogwood for quinine, and poppies for opium derivatives. The need for rapid information sharing during the war led to innovations in medical education and publishing. The Union Surgeon General's office began producing and distributing medical circulars containing the latest treatment protocols based on battlefield experience. These publications allowed new techniques to spread rapidly throughout the medical service rather than remaining isolated with individual practitioners. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, compiled from wartime records and published in the post-war years, became one of the most comprehensive medical texts of the 19th century, documenting thousands of cases with detailed illustrations and outcome data. The Civil War's legacy of medical innovation extended well beyond the conflict itself. The organizational systems developed by Letterman became the foundation for modern emergency medicine, with his principles of triage and staged evacuation still taught in contemporary medical education. The specialized hospitals established during the war evolved into the medical specialties recognized today. The massive collection of standardized medical records demonstrated the value of data-driven approaches to treatment protocols. Perhaps most importantly, the war transformed public expectations regarding the government's responsibility for medical care. The establishment of the first national system for veteran medical support created precedents for subsequent public health initiatives. The visibility of wounded veterans in communities throughout the reunified nation ensured that the human cost of war remained evident for decades, influencing both medical practice and public policy regarding those injured in service to their country. The end of hostilities in 1865 marked only the beginning of another struggle for Civil War medical personnel. As armies disbanded and military hospitals closed, thousands of physicians returned to civilian practice, permanently changed by their wartime experiences. Many carried psychological wounds as deep as those they had treated on the battlefield. Post-war surveys of Union medical officers revealed alarming rates of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. A study conducted by the Massachusetts Medical Society in 1869 found that approximately 40% of former military surgeons reported persistent nightmares featuring battlefield scenes, with many describing intrusive memories that disrupted their civilian practice. One former regimental surgeon from Pennsylvania wrote that, "The sounds of the amputation saw return to me unbidden, particularly when I am fatigued, causing my hands to tremble so severely that I must occasionally excuse myself from delicate procedures." Alcohol abuse emerged as a common coping mechanism among former military physicians. The same Massachusetts study indicated that nearly 35% of surveyed doctors reported significantly increased alcohol consumption following their war service, with many explicitly connecting their drinking to attempts at suppressing traumatic memories. Medical licensing boards across the reunified nation noted a troubling increase in cases involving physician intoxication during the post-war decades, with military service histories frequently appearing in disciplinary records. Opiate addiction represented another devastating legacy of Civil War medicine. Having witnessed morphine's effectiveness in managing pain, many physicians had developed liberal prescribing habits that continued into their civilian practices. More concerning, significant numbers of medical personnel themselves became dependent on opiates initially used to manage their own exhaustion or psychological distress during the war. An 1871 report from the American Medical Association estimated that nearly 45,000 former soldiers suffered from what was then called Army disease or soldier's disease, terms that served as euphemisms for morphine addiction resulting from battlefield injuries or military service. The psychological impact extended beyond substance abuse to fundamental changes in personality and worldview. Colleagues and family members of returning medical personnel frequently commented on their emotional detachment, irritability, and diminished capacity for empathy, classic symptoms of what modern clinicians would identify as combat-related trauma. A Philadelphia physician observed of his former medical school classmate who had served as a field surgeon. He returned from the war a different man entirely, cold, mechanical in his interactions with patients, and possessed of a fatalistic outlook entirely foreign to his pre-war character. For Confederate medical personnel, these psychological challenges were compounded by the South's devastating defeat and subsequent economic collapse. Southern physicians often returned to communities where their pre-war practices had been destroyed, medical facilities burned, and potential patients impoverished. A survey of Virginia physicians in 1870 found that over 60% of doctors who had served in the Confederate medical department reported incomes less than half their pre-war earnings, creating financial stress that exacerbated psychological difficulties. The war's aftermath also saw the establishment of the first comprehensive system for managing disabled veterans in American history. The unprecedented number of amputees, chronically ill, and psychologically damaged former soldiers necessitated institutional responses unlike anything previously attempted. By 1866, the federal government had established the National Asylum for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, representing the nation's first system of government hospitals dedicated to long-term care of veterans. These institutions, eventually expanded to include branches in Maine, Wisconsin, Virginia, and several other states, provided medical care, housing, vocational training, and social support for veterans unable to reintegrate into civilian society. By 1876, over 7,000 disabled Union veterans resided in these facilities, with thousands more receiving outpatient services. The homes represented a revolutionary concept that the government bore ongoing responsibility for those physically damaged in its service, extending beyond the limited pension systems of previous conflicts. The pension system itself underwent dramatic expansion following the Civil War. The General Pension Act of 1862 had established basic disability payments for Union veterans, but subsequent legislation significantly broadened eligibility and increased payment amounts. By 1890, the Dependent Pension Act extended benefits to any Union veteran who had served at least 90 days and was unable to perform manual labor, regardless of whether his disability stemmed directly from military service. This expansion transformed the pension system into the nation's first broad-scale social welfare program, eventually covering approximately 28% of all Northern men over age 65. Confederate veterans, however, received no federal benefits, as the former Confederate government had ceased to exist, and the U.S. government classified them as having fought against the nation rather than for it. This disparity created significant hardship for disabled Southern veterans, who relied instead on limited state pension programs and private charitable organizations. The Association for the Relief of Maimed Soldiers, Ladies' Aid Societies, and various state-level Confederate veteran organizations attempted to fill this gap, but their resources paled in comparison to the federal system available to Union veterans. The medical knowledge generated during the conflict produced its most tangible legacy in the massive 6-volume Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, published by the U.S. government between 1870 and 1888. This unprecedented work compiled detailed records of more than 240,000 medical cases from the war, including statistical analyses, treatment outcomes, and hundreds of detailed illustrations. The publication represented the first large-scale, data-driven medical research project in American history and established standards for evidence-based medicine that influenced medical practice worldwide. European medical journals praised the work as revolutionary, with the British Medical Journal calling it the most comprehensive analysis of military medical experience ever produced. German military surgeons particularly studied the extensive data on amputation outcomes, incorporating these findings into their field medical protocols prior to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. The work's influence extended beyond military medicine, as its detailed case histories provided valuable information for civilian practitioners treating traumatic injuries and infectious diseases. The war's influence on American medical education proved equally profound. Pre-war medical training had typically consisted of 2 4-month terms of lectures with no required clinical experience. The inadequacy of this preparation became painfully evident during the conflict, prompting significant post-war reforms. Harvard Medical School extended its program to 3 years in 1871 and added required clinical rotations, with other institutions following suit. By 1880, the Association of American Medical Colleges had established minimum standards requiring practical clinical instruction, laboratory work, and extended study periods. The experiences of Jonathan Letterman and other medical administrators during the war directly influenced the development of civilian emergency medical systems. The concept of triage, systematic prioritization of patients based on severity rather than arrival time, gradually entered civilian practice in the 1870s, particularly in urban hospitals facing high patient volumes. The tiered evacuation system developed for battlefield casualties evolved into the modern paradigm of pre-hospital care, emergency departments, and specialized treatment facilities. Women's roles in medicine underwent permanent transformation following their wartime service. The demonstrated competence of female nurses during the conflict helped overcome traditional resistance to women in healthcare. The first formal nursing schools in America were established in the post-war period, including Bellevue Training School and Massachusetts General Hospital School of Nursing, both explicitly modeling their programs on lessons learned from Civil War nursing experiences. Clara Barton's founding of the American Red Cross in 1881 represented a direct extension of her Civil War work. Having witnessed the benefits of organized civilian relief efforts during the conflict, Barton created an institution specifically designed to provide humanitarian assistance during both wartime and peacetime disasters. The organization's early focus on disaster preparedness reflected lessons learned from the improvised and often inadequate responses to Civil War casualties. Public health initiatives also emerged from wartime experiences. Union and Confederate medical officers had observed the devastating impact of preventable diseases on military effectiveness, with typhoid, dysentery, and other infectious diseases causing far more deaths than enemy action. This recognition led to increased emphasis on sanitation and disease prevention in post-war public health programs. Former military physicians frequently became advocates for municipal clean water systems, improved sewage disposal, and vaccination campaigns. The specialization that began with dedicated hospitals for specific injuries during the war accelerated in the post-war medical community. Physicians who had focused exclusively on orthopedic cases, facial wounds, or neurological injuries during the conflict often maintained these specializations in civilian practice. The first American specialty medical organizations emerged in the post-war decades, including the American Ophthalmological Society and American Neurological Association, both heavily influenced by Civil War medical experiences. For individual patients, the war's medical legacy lasted lifetimes. Hundreds of thousands of veterans lived with chronic conditions resulting from battlefield injuries or camp diseases. Pension records document the long-term consequences of seemingly survivable wounds: osteomyelitis from incompletely healed fractures, neuromas at amputation sites causing lifelong pain, pulmonary diseases from chest wounds, and chronic digestive disorders from abdominal injuries. A study of Massachusetts veterans conducted in 1889 found that 74% of wounded survivors reported ongoing medical issues directly related to their war injuries, with 31% classified as permanently disabled. The psychological consequences proved equally enduring. What physicians of the era described as nostalgia, irritable heart, or exhausted heart in Civil War veterans closely matches modern descriptions of depression, anxiety disorders, and PTSD. These conditions received little effective treatment in the 19th century, leading many veterans to self-medicate with alcohol or opiates. Residents of soldiers' homes frequently displayed symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma, including flashbacks, hypervigilance, and emotional numbing that persisted decades after the conflict ended. Perhaps the most significant legacy of Civil War medicine was its demonstration of both the terrible costs of industrial warfare and humanity's capacity to respond to such suffering with innovation and compassion. The conflict forced American medicine to rapidly evolve from an apprenticeship-based craft into a more scientific, systematic profession. The organizational systems, triage protocols, and evacuation methods developed amid the chaos of battlefields established foundations for modern emergency medicine and trauma care. The unprecedented scale of the Civil War's medical challenge, over 700,000 dead and more than 1 million wounded, created a watershed moment in American healthcare. The inadequacies exposed by this enormous burden of suffering drove reforms that transformed medical education, hospital design, nursing practice, and public health initiatives. Government responsibility for veteran care expanded dramatically, establishing precedents for later social welfare programs. For the battlefield medics themselves, the war represented both professional crucible and personal trauma. Many emerged from the conflict with skills and knowledge that advanced their careers, but carried psychological wounds that never fully healed. Their experiences, documented in diaries, letters, medical records, and pension applications, provide a window into one of history's most difficult medical challenges, providing humane care amid the inhumanity of industrial warfare. As the last Civil War veterans died in the mid-20th century, their physical presence faded, but the medical lessons learned through their suffering continue to influence healthcare today. Modern emergency medicine, military medical corps, trauma surgery protocols, and disaster response systems all bear the imprint of innovations born in those desperate field hospitals. The physicians, nurses, and stretcher bearers who faced the overwhelming challenge of Civil War battlefield medicine left a legacy that extends far beyond the conflict itself, a legacy written not just in medical textbooks, but in lives saved on battlefields and in emergency rooms ever since.